Today's teaching, and for the next few weeks, we are calling this Counting the Omer. This is going to be part 2, basically, as we continue to just study some things on Matthew chapter 5.
Did you figure out what day we're on?
I'm about to look that up right now because I meant to do that this morning, and I did not, and I'm not doing what I should be doing as far as counting the Omer. So, I believe it's around 18 or 19.
Do you have any more of those sheets? That seems to misplace mine.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so I was off by one day. Today is day 20. So we are about a little over a third, right, of the way there. So today is day 20 of Counting the Omer. And so we will just study several areas of Scripture that we might come across over the next few weeks with the subject in mind of what it means to receive God's Word. I really appreciate Larry actually kind of setting us off in this direction by a couple weeks ago asking the question of what does this really seem to mean or signify. We're in Matthew chapter 5. Yeshua makes his point about do not think that I've come to abolish the prophet or the law and the prophets. I've not come to abolish but to fulfill is the rest of that verse. We will get there very soon. Last week we set a big stage for what this situation looks like with Yeshua going up on the mountain to speak. And I noticed today as I was reading through the verses again that it says, and he opened his mouth and began to speak to them, or opened his mouth and began to teach them. And it just stood out to me as different. And I really, really think, remember what we talked about last week, I really think that the reason why the author wrote it that way in Greek and why we end up translating it that way in English is because the author very clearly is connecting this situation of Yeshua being on the mountain and opening his mouth and speaking to the people and the people hearing it. He's connecting that to the experience of the people that were at the mountain when the Israelites came out of Egypt. And they reached the mountain and received the word of God. Because remember, we've been led to believe, we understand that the people, from what the text says, were scared. Well, in this experience with Yeshua, as he's pronouncing the blessings over them, and when they went to Mount Gerizim and the 6 tribes were up on there before, and they built an altar, and they pronounced the blessings, so to speak, there would have been nothing but great joy that the people would have been experiencing. Not fear, not grief, not scaredness or anything else, especially when it wasn't God speaking to them, but them speaking out what he said in his Torah. And so this really would have been a big deal. And I really think that the reason why the author worded things the way he does in this passage is because that's what he has in mind. He's connecting that relationship as all the people would have that day. So that's why I really tried to put that emphasis on it last week in our teaching so that we can have that because we aren't really raised with that understanding. And in the Old Testament, in Deuteronomy, in the Shema, the commandment is given that we are to teach our children. And I can't tell you how many passages, maybe 5 or 6 passages at least, I think, throughout the Torah, that give us a commandment to raise our children up with an understanding of the miracles that were experienced in the Exodus, not even just during the celebration of the Passover Seder, but even if they come and ask you during that time. We are to articulate to them and to share with them what the experience is. And not that Yeshua's experience on the cross is degraded in any way, or not that we shouldn't talk about that, because obviously, clearly, we should talk about him as Messiah and share that as well. But there is also a really significant reason to know why to share the miracles and the experiences of the people before us. In some of our circumstances, we may not necessarily, in my situation, for the rest of you, this may not be the same case. But in my situation, I can't say that I wasn't raised without some understanding or going to Sunday schools or going to churches or having even at very young ages some experiences. I had some, but it wasn't certainly a regular practice. And when my mom and my stepdad got divorced when I was around 11, there was very, very little involvement until I was a teenager, and kind of as what we thought was the right thing to do, the parents would invest the teenager into some kind of Bible study group or whatever else, some kind of teen group just to try and get some influence. So there was some, but it wasn't a real understanding until I got older and kind of intentionally chose to look for it. And now I really see the benefit. I want to make sure I phrase it right, because I'm not trying to hold my mom accountable for anything wrong, because I don't think she knew, because I don't think it was really shared in her life, so I don't think that was her fault, so to speak. But I just see the benefit of what it means to really understand what relationship with God looks like and to know the history of what he's done with his chosen people and his kingdom, so that as you articulate that to your children, they have an interest and a fascination in getting into it. And 9 times out of 10, and what God commands us to remember and to tell our children is not our contemporary traditional practices of understand that you're a sinful being and that you're not going to be able to produce much of anything good, and Yeshua's come and laid down his life for you. Now get along and do your best to not become part of the world. And when children are given this ideology, they really kind of struggle. And so I think that it behooves us much better of a good to really connect people with the miracles that were performed and the things that God has done. More than likely, I'm probably not the only one sitting in this room that can say they've experienced a miracle in their life and have had an interactive relationship with God where they clearly, without a doubt, understood that it was Him working in their life. And learning how to be able to express that, I think, can be much more potent. And not that we shouldn't understand sin, and not that we shouldn't understand what we need to do about it or what Yeshua does about it, but I think it's much more potent to help people develop a relationship with God when they understand what the presence looks like of Him in your life and what the benefit is of maturing that relationship with Him. Right? I think the rest just kind of comes naturally as you have that. So,
Before you get into the actual teaching, I want to take this time to prove how ignorant I am and how much understanding I don't have. But I've struggled with this phrase, I've not come to do away with the law, but to fulfill it.
mm-hmm.
And I guess it's the fulfill part that I don't really understand, because when I think something is fulfilled, it's done with. There's nothing more you can do. You've done everything you can, and so you walk away. But obviously that's not what other people do. And I continue to struggle with that, to understand.
It's complete in its purpose.
Yeah, it's complete. If it's completed its purpose, then why continue dealing with it? It's already done.
Why didn't we get raptured right away?
Huh?
Why didn't we get raptured right away?
No.
No? Because I always wondered that. If He fulfilled it, why are we still here? Like, what's the point?
But anyway, it's just if I make myself even more muddy, then forgive me if you understand what I'm trying to say.
No, I do, because I've had this conversation multiple times, and this is the contemporary belief from the verse, is that Yeshua, and I'm going to kind of paraphrase, the idea is taught, Yeshua fulfilled it, so now I don't have to.
Yep.
That's the teaching. That's what comes from this, right? I could name to you some very basic, simple laws that you've completed and filled in, or fulfilled, and filled in is another way to translate what that Greek word actually means, right? It's like filling in a document. But I could name to you several laws that you have filled in to their completion and still continue to every time you get behind the wheel of your car. And this is an example of the teaching that I give to help reflect on some of this, is if you and I are driving through my neighborhood in Heartland Crossing, every time you see a 25 mile an hour speed limit, you obey that law and you drive at 25 miles an hour for the main purpose of you want to protect the sanctity of life in that community. You know that if you're driving 45 or 50 miles an hour, the ticket is the least of your worries. The worst of your worries would be that you hit a child as you're coming around a corner, right? So you understand that the fulfillment of that law is something that needs to be filled in not only the first time, but the second time, the third time, the fourth time, and every infinity time you find yourself behind the wheel of that car driving around that corner, right? And in conjunction with that, if I happen to be driving behind you going through that neighborhood and you follow the law and drive 25 miles an hour, in your mind, does that unobligate me from driving 25 miles an hour? Can I now drive 50 miles an hour through the community and through the neighborhood because you followed the law and filled it in for me in front of me? Does that unobligate me from having to keep it? Of course not, because the purpose of keeping it is to have the sanctity of life protected within the community. That's the purpose of the traffic law. It's not because if you drive over the speed limit, you're getting a ticket, right? So the penalty is not the purpose. And oftentimes that's what we make the purpose of God's law, is what we perceive of as the penalty of not being able to do or having to do. Because we look at God's commandment as either do this or don't do this, which is falls in one of those two categories, as a penalty of love. And we look at the penalty as the purpose as having been done away with, no longer applicable. That's why I consistently teach in here that the purpose of God's commandments is living successfully in the land. It's not to gain salvation or to be in a place. Dave wants to share something.
Well, there's some people who say that the purpose of all those laws was to help the Jewish people survive and continue to worship God as their only God, not to be influenced by the people around them. And that was the reason why God gave those particular laws to them. And not to anyone else, He gave it to them alone for that specific purpose. That purpose of even doing it in its entirety was to bring salvation to the human race through Jesus Christ. And thus, the purpose of the law was fulfilled and completed when Jesus came. And that's the understanding of.
Some people do believe that. Are you one of those people, Dave?
Oh, sure, I have been for a long time.
Okay, I am not. Because I don't believe that's the purpose. I don't believe that's the purpose of the law, and I believe that those who do believe that and would teach that perspective are teaching outside of what the Scripture seems to deal with. Another Scripture that we'd have to put in conjunction
They
with that
disagree
idea.
with that too.
One Scripture that we have to put into understanding what the purpose of the law is and what it drives to do in its presence here is a couple different things. One, sin is Torahlessness. Sin is lawlessness, right? The Scripture is very clear about that. So if you still can look around this world and see sin, which all of us do, then that means that regardless of what man comes along and teaches that it's been done away with, they're wrong because it clearly is still active. Because as the Scripture also says, the Torah, the law, is what gives sin its power. If God had not made a commandment about whether or not something was sinful, then you wouldn't be able to look at it and identify it as sinful. So this means that regardless of what I teach in here, regardless of what anybody else teaches, you can still effectively in this world see the clarity and the power of it. It's still very clearly effective. Now, usually most Christians that I would have this discussion with then tell me that because they're a Christian believer and they believe in Yeshua, it has no power over them. But another argument that you have to understand about the text is that, and we've talked about this verse several times, a lot of this would have been coming out when we get to this verse. We'll cover most of it this morning. We'll do it again over the next couple weeks. There's another verse, and I believe it's Corinthians, that says Yeshua is, and we translate it in English as the end of the law. And again, end means a finality, and it means it's over and done with. But the Greek word is best translated as end goal. When I say to you, do you know what the end goal is of you coming in here and ordering food? Your end goal is that you expect to have that food prepared and receive it and eat it, right? And so Paul is very clear as an observer of the Torah. He rushed to get back to Jerusalem for Passover. He rushed to get back for Shavuot long after Yeshua had died, risen, gone back to heaven, had a relationship with him on the road, struck him down, blinded him, put him in a position to understand he was the Messiah. He still continued to observe and do the things God commanded. And the reason why, he says, is that Yeshua is the end goal of the law. What that means is, if you are keeping and doing the things God has commanded in his Torah, you will look like Yeshua. If we teach that he has done away with it and fulfilled it, then you won't be able to look like him because you won't be keeping it and doing it. You understand? That's why I disagree with what Dave is saying, is because you now will be powerless to look like who Yeshua is. And remember, the Torah, God's law and instruction, is what makes him the unblemished Passover lamb. It's what defines what a blemish looks like. It defines that, in a sense. So without the power of that, one, we don't know what sin is, we don't have the ability to look like him, and we don't have the ability to identify him as the Passover lamb sacrificially able to lay down his life, so to speak. And it's not even necessarily the full Torah that initiates the idea that a human life would be what was laid down or is considered, right? It's, a human life is not considered adequate sacrifice when it comes to what was performed in the temple. But the shedding of blood, the giving of blood, right? The shedding of that nefesh is what covers the sin. That's what Paul talks about. Does anybody else have any questions? Did this make sense to you? Does it share anymore, or did I just exasperate the problem?
I got a
It
question.
acts it does, because you said, I see Jesus, what you said, Jesus is the end goal. That's what I sort of inferred, whether you know it or not, or realize it or not. That the goal of keeping the Hebrew nation along a narrow path towards Jesus Jesus was the end goal of what God did with the Jewish people. And that's what I said too.
So that verse, let me read it in its context to make sure we have understanding. That verse is not in Corinthians, like I said. It's in Romans. And it's verse 4. In verse 3, hold on a second. Okay, so in verse 10, if you even were to understand this, it's subtitled, "The Word of Faith Brings Salvation." And what Paul's been talking about is to the Roman Gentile believers. He's been talking about the Jews to whom God has entrusted. He's been setting the stage since way back in the beginning of the letter in Romans. He's been setting the stage that God entrusted the oracles of the knowledge of the kingdom of heaven to the Jewish people, and that the Jewish people are God's chosen people, that he has established his kingdom in, around, whatever you want to say. And it is into this, because, right, he goes into the adoption of sons later in Romans as well. That's where we get all this language, and that's because he's explaining to these individuals what it means to be adopted and what God has already established. Brothers and sisters, my heart's desire and my prayer to God for them is for their salvation. For I testify about them that they have a zeal for God, but not in accordance with knowledge. For not knowing about God's righteousness and seeking to establish their own, they did not subject themselves to the righteousness of God. He's talking about Yeshua. He says, for Christ is, and we translate at the end, for Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes.
Not the end of the law, but the
The word telos is the word here. And if you want to look it up on our own, we can. And another way the word is commonly translated is as a poll tax. You've heard the word poll tax throughout the New Testament, right? A poll tax is the expected end that you anticipate paying when you travel with your goods to that destination. So when you get to the end of that destination, that's what you expect to pay, right? Yeah, a poll tax. It's a custom, or a poll tax is either one of the ways that it's translated. A custom or a poll tax. That's something, so whether you're coming in, arriving with goods, or whether you're traveling through a destination, whatever the goal is, when you arrive in that place, that's the expected end that you expect to pay. It's something that's established. You know what it's going to be. It's like a toll. You're driving through roads here. You know when you get to this area, that's the expected toll.
Did you say T?
Yes.
O-L, not P.
No,
I said poll tax is one of the ways that it's translated. What do you want to say about that, Dave?
Nothing. I just got it straight. I thought you said P-O-L-L.
I did the first time.
Poll taxes. Poll tax.
Well, go ahead. What is a poll tax?
It has to do with voting or electing somebody to govern over you.
Either way, you have an expected end and a set, not rate, but you have a set established end goal that's established there, right? And a custom, you understand? It's translated as all of these words. A custom, right, is something that you intend to pay when you're bringing in goods as a merchant or anything else. Whatever it is you're expecting to have, that end goal is established. You can visually see what it is. That's the point. What he's saying is that Christ is that of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. If you want to be righteous in your life, then you observe the Torah in the way that he did, not in the way the rabbis
Not in believing in the law, you believe in God.
Yes, right? Again, John's gospel shares with us that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and was made flesh and dwelt among us. So what Paul has established and what he's also understood is that Christ is that same thing. For Paul, as a Pharisee, who had an understanding of what men had been debating for decades as his older age of being a Pharisee and studying this. The difference between all of that experience and then seeing Christ on the road is not necessarily in the miracle of having been struck down and made blind and having to go out, but it's in the fact that he spent 3.5 years after that studying the scriptures and seeing that what these people were teaching and what men had been saying about the purpose of the law, of keeping it, what it would amount to, what it should look like, he clearly was able to discern between that and see that the way Christ had observed it and what he put emphasis on and what he focused on is what makes you look Christ-like. Because clearly Christ was Christ-like at the end of his life, right? Throughout his life, you understand? So when he's writing this, what he's saying is that that end goal, that end custom that you should expect to pay, that attitude that you should expect to have in your life in observing and keeping what God has commanded is him. That's what you're going to look like. Does that make sense? It seems like
It's a goal to try and reach.
You want to say anything, Art?
No, just listening.
Okay.
I got a question. Why do I see three things? I see commandments, I see laws, and I see precepts.
Because there are different words. They clarify different states of instruction. Sometimes there are, sometimes it's difficult for me to explain this, but like as an example, you and I would consider it sin of thou shalt not commit adultery. And so somebody who's thinking about missing or committing adultery is clearly caught up in an issue, right? We call that sin. We identify that. If I say to you, and I'm just going to make up something stupid here because I don't know any other way to describe this. If I just say to you, thou shalt not lay down carpet without thy tack strips, if you lay down carpet without tack strips, that's not necessarily a sin as much as what we look at other things.
Thank you.
But it's still an instruction, and that's just a dumb thing that I shared. But what I'm trying to say is, in the realm of building management, when it comes to how you have to use certain kinds of pipe, or you have to use certain kinds of wire, and you have to run it certain ways, you have codes around the way in which you do that. That's what some of the instruction is that God's given, and usually that pertains to different fields of personal investment or things that we may not do, right? You may be a farmer, so you may go and sow seed in certain ways. If you happen to do something outside the scope of that, whether it's intentional or whether it's unintentional, is what's going to make the difference, right? If you're going out of your way to start mixing a bunch of seeds together and mixing plants together, and you could care less, and you're just doing whatever you want, that's an aggrievement. That's a sin that's different than going out and, accidentally somehow your seeds get mixed together. I mean, even a farmer knows that for the most part, if you just throw a bunch of seed all in the same hole, you're going to be lucky if anything grows well on one plant, right? But I can't. Another way of describing this, I was listening to Rabbi Akiva Tatz again last night, and this is going to be a very deep way of trying to describe something. And this is something that, again, kind of goes with what Dave was saying about what other people believe and what some people believe about why God gave the law. He tends to teach and come from a perspective of that a wrong way to look at it is that the world was in existence first, and the Torah happened to come and write about it and say, don't do this because it was savvily able to identify certain things. Like as an example, pork or pigs have tapeworm. And tapeworm obviously can cause an issue, a major, huge issue for the body, and can be a big deal. And so a lot of people look at a commandment of what and how to use and what to do to identify what land animals should be as food. And we look at this ideology and say, well, the Torah is pretty wise and it's pretty smart because it happened to identify, before we really had the ability to identify this, that pork has tapeworm. And so when, God saw that people wouldn't be able to get this on their own, he just went ahead and gave it to him then. And now it identifies something that's true, but we don't have to worry about it now because we figured out a way to, get over dealing with tapeworm. And his Rabbi Akiva Tatz's opinion of this is that is absolutely the wrong way of understanding and having your brain articulate the knowledge and the understanding of God's Torah or his law. And we as Christians should be able to agree with him because, again, John's gospel says in the beginning was the Word was with God, it became flesh and dwelt among us. And so what his teaching is to say that when a pig is created, it, I'm paraphrasing, kind of looks at itself and says, oh, I'm a pig. That means I need to have tapeworm. That means I need to have all the things about me that God created because that's what I am. And so the Torah existed first. It's not that the world existed first and the Torah came and wrote about what it is, but the Torah was first, and so the world is the way it is because the Torah says it is. And one of the proofs or one of the examples that he gives of this, and I want you to deeply consider this for a moment, of thinking about the people to whom it was given, when it was given, whether or not they had some form of illiteracy, as I've heard some people say, whether or not they had some form of inability to write or to understand the world, or let alone whether or not they even had access to the entire planet at the time that it was given. One of the statements that they have that they derive from the Torah is that it specifically says, when dealing with land animals, that they should have a cloven hoof and chew the cud. It specifically names that there are 3 that chew the cud but do not have a cloven hoof, and there is only 1 that has a split hoof and doesn't chew the cud, which is the pig. The Torah, when given, specifically states, and this is their view of it, is that in the entire world of existence, there is only 1 animal that has a split hoof and doesn't chew the cud, and we shouldn't consider it food. And 2,000 plus years later, since the crucifixion of Yeshua, 5,000, some 6,000 some years after Adam's creation, science still has yet to find another animal that that's true about. So clearly, man didn't write that. God knows that because he created the Torah first in the beginning, and the Torah is the reason why the world exists the way it does. When a fish is created, it knows whether or not it's a shellfish or it's a fish with fins or scales. And when that fish is created and comes into existence, if it's a catfish and it knows that it doesn't have scales and it only has fins, it knows that it's a tameh fish, which means unclean, and that it's to swim around down in the shmutz. It's to swim around down in the muck. The animals, the things that God creates, know what they are as they come into creation because the Torah identifies what they are. It's not as though the world existed first and God just then decided to write about it. It's that when we have an opportunity to look into his commandments, look into his world, or into his word, we have an opportunity to look into the blueprints of creation. That's the correct view of looking at it. So when God says that an animal that doesn't have both chewing the cud and the cloven hoof, it should not be considered, it should be considered unclean for you, and it should not be considered as food. It's not only a physical thing. It's also a spiritual thing that existed first from the beginning of time. And when he says that that animal should be unclean and not be considered the food substance that you use to keep your soul in your body, it's not just a physical issue. It's also a spiritual issue because he designed them for a completely different purpose. If I'm able to get that point across at some point, when we would have had, I have a more in-depth teaching I plan to do at some point I haven't gotten to yet about kosher eating. But if anything else, that's the one point we should always try and drive home is God is the one who is the author of the purpose of the thing he creates. And if he is determined, right, in his word, what its usage should be or what it's to do in its creation, and we're able to see that, and we're able to identify, I mean, when it comes to kosher eating, there's 2 commandments that you actually have about what to consider food. I'm just talking about the land animals right now. There's a 2-step process. One, he tells you to observe the animal, look into it, observe whether or not it has those 2 features. Then, based on whether or not you can observe those 2 features, is based on whether or not you consider it food. Let's say you just look at the animal and you observe that it has one feature, which is a cloven hoof. You can see that visually on the outside, right? Can you see visually on the outside whether or not it chews the cud? You do. So what does that mean? That means that it requires you to spend time investigating whether or not you should be using that substance as the fuel that keeps your spirit in your body. So that means you're going to have to observe the animal for some time, and you're going to have to watch it, and you're going to have to find out by observing and watching it that it does chew the cud. And when you do, then you can look at it the way that you do. Look at it as food. Go ahead, David.
Is there any reason that you perceive in the Bible why God chose just that one group of people? Why didn't he choose all the people, or at least the Chinese or Japanese? Or
there are traditional funny statements that go along with it, but there is not an explanation, I don't think, in the text. And I think that's just one of the mysteries of God's relationship with his creation. I just think that's one of the mysteries. I mean, in a way, I think it's the answer that I would give, in a way, would be the same answer that God gave me years ago when I questioned for about 2.5 years. Okay, so you guys know that I teach all these different things about the Hebrew alphabet letters and what they symbolize and picture. The very first letter of the Hebrew alphabet is the letter Aleph. It has a numerical value of 1. God is 1. It's constructed with a vav in the middle, which has a value of 6, and then 2 yods, which has a value of 10 each, which is 26 in its construction. God's four-letter holy name has a value of 26. The Hebrew word aleph is a word that means master. It is the master of all the letters. That's the first one. God is the master of the universe, right? I could go on all day long about all these connections. But the one thing that fascinates me the most is that the word aleph also means an ox. And it symbolizes an ox. And the first Proto-Hebrew symbol, the hieroglyphic type symbol, was an ox's head. And it was an ox's head. It was like a little triangle like this with a couple of horns on it. This is like the first Proto-Sinaitic, they're like hieroglyphics, like carvings they would find in the Hebrew alphabet, right? It was an ox's head. And for a long time this confused me, and I didn't understand why would God use what for the most part is clearly a servant beast to represent him. Why would that be? Because, and I don't know if all of you believe this or not, but as I've studied Hebrew over the years, I absolutely learned and I believe that it is a divine language. I believe it is the first language on the earth, and I believe that there's a great uniqueness to the way that the words, the letters, and everything else are made because it was designed by him. I believe this. So why would he allow for this situation? And it took me a long, long time to, I guess, mature enough to the point where I was able to really accept the answer. And then one day, like a still small voice, it came to me. Because people will have to choose intentionally to love me. Or to whip me into shape like they think I'm some servant beast. And I may not have the full answer, but that is, for the most part, the regular way we have relationship with him. We either come to him as the master of the universe, and we understand that he is the master of all of creation and all of the universe, or we treat him like he's some servant beast that we can whip into shape and have him do whatever we want. We treat him in one of those two ways. And when we have an issue...
Wait a minute. There's other ways people treat him.
Yeah, maybe variants in between, but I think those are pretty much two ends of the spectrum. And I think, how much love we have for him, I think obviously speaks volumes about how we treat him. And then certainly our maturity level, right? You can still love God tremendously and not want to ever be grieving of his spirit in any way, shape, or form, but you can still be immature and do it without hazard, right? It's when you mature and you eventually learn certain areas of your life where, man, I just kept throwing prayers up to God thinking that he was obligated to answer every single one. Now I'm starting to see that maybe the only prayers I'm speaking personally for my own life. Now I see that the only prayers I should be casting up to him are the things that I have clearly identified I can't do on my own, and I need his help. Everything else that I used to pray about, that stuff I can do. I need to stop sitting around just trying to fold my hands and close my eyes and take a nap, and I need to get up and do the work he's prepared for me. That's why I know about it. It's not so I can just sit down and pray. It's there so that I can participate with the individual. When Randy called me last night, it wasn't so that I could just sit back and do nothing and say, oh man, so sorry to hear you and Susan are going through that. It was so that I could, one, pray with him a little bit over the phone so that I could prepare what I think maybe could be done to help pray for him in this group or in tomorrow's group, and so that I could make sure I'm there to provide whatever else I can come alongside him and do, right? Not just pray that even though God's had him call me, God brings somebody else into his life to help him. You know what I mean? So for me personally, as I've matured, those are things that change. But either way, I'm kind of two ends of the spectrum. We have a relational issue to grow and mature in on how we treat him. And God allows for some to look at him as a servant. And in fact, what does Yeshua say of himself? I didn't come to be served, but to serve. What do you do with that? How do you look at who he is as he has laid down his life for you and has come to serve the world, the creation that his Father made? So when it comes to what you were asking me, like God's people, and why did he choose the Jews, as we refer to them, as they refer to themselves, why did he choose that particular race? In a way, the question is, why didn't he choose all of us, right? I think what he did was establish a kingdom, chose to establish it in and around the people, and over time, obviously, clearly, has invited all people to come into it. You just have to be intentional to choose to.
Yeah, the question why is a very difficult one. And I've found an answer to it because it answers all whys, the why questions. But one has to wonder why he didn't start it with Noah. Why didn't he give him those laws instead of the Hebrew nation, which came a lot later?
Oh, there, again, I have to go with the traditional teaching about who Noah is and what that circumstance was like, because it's very different than what we normally, I think, are led to believe. And I think I agree with the commentary. The commentary is that when God says to him, Asa lacha, make for yourself an ark, I'm going to kind of paraphrase the conversation because some of the text does share us this. They tell us that Noah was righteous, right? But the Torah goes out of its way to say he was righteous in his generation. When the Torah says that Moses was righteous and it says that Abraham was righteous, it doesn't put that little caveat. And they say that the reason why is because Noah kept to himself. He stayed aloof from the world. And so while the world was chasing after the things that were going on at that time that required a flood to change, Noah just kept to himself and didn't try and help anybody get onto a path of repentance, which is clearly the difference between people like him and Abraham and Moses. He just kept to himself.
The Bible doesn't say that.
So again, the commentary around what the Bible does say, it puts the caveat of in his generation, where it doesn't share that with other individuals that it speaks about. So to come up with an understanding of why perhaps it shares that is fair to me and understandable.
But that's doing the very thing that I have to guard against, which is to come up with an idea, a way why, and then look for the answer in there that explains my why. In other words, justifies my opinion.
Well, you were the one who asked the why. Why didn't he give it to Noah? So I'm simply volunteering an answer. Whether or not you believe it is
faith.
Certainly up to you.
The answer is why, to all whys, is faith.
So I think it's about intentionality, right, and how you display outwardly, your inward commitment. So you're going to treat God in the way you really truly feel about him inside, and you're going to come to his kingdom. You're going to come to an involvement of being a member of that, so to speak, in the way you really feel about it inside and what is important to you. I mean, even today in our contemporary churches, in our groups, we can show up at the group because we feel good about just sitting down and having fellowship with one another and enjoy that time together. Or we can also do it because we intend to learn, we intend to share and learn from those, not just one person in particular, but from the entire group of people that are there, so that we can change and grow. And then we can also come planning to sit down and fellowship, learn from those around us to change and grow, so that we can go out and impact the community around us and continue to make a change, right? There's always new levels of maturity. And every new level that we find ourselves at, we need to do a self-evaluative check and find out, how much am I doing because it's self-serving? Larry?
I didn't want to leave with him with the statements he made, because I've been studying this hard since before I asked the question. And, I still think Matthew is the best scribe. And I think he was writing the real words of Jesus. And you can go to different translations, and what I'm looking at here says, do not presume that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. Two different things. I did not come to abolish, which is referring to the law, but to fulfill, which is referring to the prophets. The prophets all prophesied that he was coming. And so he did come to fulfill what the prophets were saying. He didn't come. Immediately after the word fulfill, he goes on and says, for truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away. Well, heaven and earth don't pass away, folks, until the second coming of Jesus and the judgment. That's when there's going to be a new heaven and a new earth. The one we're on doesn't pass away until after his second coming and judgment. So he says, for truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke of a letter shall pass from the law until all is accomplished. And all is accomplished means just what he said. When heaven and earth pass away, the end of sin, the end of evil, it's the final judgment. Everything's wonderful after that in our new earth that we will live on, our new heaven, whichever you want to refer to it. But then he even goes on to warn in the next verse. He says, Therefore, whoever nullifies one of the least of these commandments and teaches others, which is us, to do the same shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever keeps and teaches these commandments, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Now, I don't know how Jesus' own words recorded by Matthew can be any clearer than what I just read to you. And I have gone off in these commentaries, there's people way over here that says the laws are gone. When Jesus died on the cross, that was the end of the law. And there's people way over here that say the strict Jewish laws of Moses, even including sacrifices, which don't happen because there's no temple right now, are what you have to live with. And there's people in between that say, well, only a part of the law still applies. All the rituals and stuff are gone, but the part of God's Moses law that applies to us as humans and how we live our lives still exists. Then we should be honoring all those laws. So, out of the 613 commandments in the Torah, some of them are dealing with sacrifice and all that, but a chunk of them deal with how we should live our lives. So I'd like to see somebody go through the Torah and separate the two things.
That's what I was,
Yeah,
I would love to see somebody take them apart and see which ones they think apply to
but
us.
he
I
even-
think it's been done, but
He even warned people, all of us reading this Bible, that whoever teaches any of us that we shouldn't still be obeying the laws that he gave Moses is wrong. He'll be considered the least in heaven if you do that. That's what it says.
And we have more people doing that than we do people teaching to keep them.
Oh, well, there's people that get furious at me when I raise the question. I don't try to declare what's right and what's wrong, because I'm not smart enough to. I just read what the Bible tells
he
me.
points out what the Bible said.
And the people who are hard over it, no, the laws all died when Jesus died on the cross. I said, well, if that was true, then sin died on the cross. Well, he did. I said, sin didn't die on the cross. Jesus died on the cross and took the sins of the world with him, but sin still exists. We're still sinners, and we still have to ask for forgiveness. And why are we sinners? Sinners, you can't sin unless there's a law you're breaking.
Yeah.
What is sin? It's the breaking of God's laws.
And when Paul posits the idea that Christ took sins past, present, and then more importantly, future, when he puts it in the context of all three, it's important to recognize that future means still yet to happen. So Larry's absolutely right to say that we should expect to still see sin in the world. That's why we do.
But after the second coming, and a new earth, a new heaven, there's no more sin.
That's why I say when you sit down at the marriage supper of the Lamb, you won't be trying to figure out whether or not pork is at the table. You won't be trying to figure out whether or not things that God didn't determine as food are there for you to say no thank you or to choose not to consume. That's why the commandments are given for us here while we're here now. Because in God's kingdom, they're already established. I don't know why you guys ask me questions anymore. We're just going to start directing those questions down to the other end of the table.
No.
I think Larry
I got a question.
and
Yes, sir.
I asked the question 2 or 3 weeks ago because I wanted us to deal with it. Because I've gotten very strong opposition to just reading God's word and interpreting it right here, Jesus' word, from leaders of the church who almost think I'm preaching blasphemy by saying the laws aren't dead. And we just, people need to study this. If people want to believe all these laws of God went away with the death of Jesus on the cross, then what are the laws? What is it? And one person in a study I'm in said, well, there's only 2. He gave 2 commandments when asked what of all these laws, what's important, and he gave commanded 2 commandments.
which are love God and love your neighbor.
Yeah, and that's all there is.
Well, the answer, unfortunately, to that is if the Torah has been done away with, then those two as well are done away with, because they were commanded in Deuteronomy before Yeshua came quoting them.
I understand that, but I'm just trying to get people to really look at this and study it, because I'm in another seminar. I don't want to take too much time, but it's been going on for 2 weeks now. Every day I'm at it. That's prophecies and revelation that's being held here in Indianapolis, and it's almost draining me how much homework and stuff there is to do. But several things that I've been taught all my life as a Christian are becoming very much clearer to me in this prophecy and revelation class. And a couple of things that I believe were absolute truth. When you go through the real scriptures, which is what this class is doing, deeply into the scriptures, you can't justify that. And one of them is this law thing, that it's gone. You can't justify that. Another one is that the rapture occurs before tribulation. You can't justify that when you get into this. There's a rapture, but all these scriptures, when you really get in them, really study them, that rapture is after tribulation. It's when Jesus returns for the second time that tribulation happens. I mean, the rapture. That the church will have to go through the rapture, which is scary, because that's not what I was taught. All my life, I was taught a good Christian doesn't have to worry about tribulation, because the rapture will take us away before. There's no scriptures that you can find that says that. And there's many that refer to the rapture happening without the word rapture, but the process. And they're all tied to after tribulation.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that too, because we're coming off of that study we did from that Hellfire Manual I created, and that was one of the biggest emphasis that I still make and want to make for people, is to try and understand. I think it's important for all of us to focus on what is the central point of your faith. If your faith is hell-centric, you have an issue. If your faith is heaven-centric, and you think that everything that you've done and believed and accepted in your life means that you're going to heaven, and you focus all your time on just trying to get to heaven, you'll miss Yeshua when he comes, because you'll be looking for something else. And that's why I regularly taught that and said that. We need to make him specifically centric to our faith, because when we experience trial and tribulation, which we don't even have to wait till the end of the world for that could come tomorrow. When we face that, we still have to keep our eyes on him. Keeping your eyes on hell or keeping your eyes on heaven isn't going to get you through that moment. Anybody else have anything to share? I thought you were going to ask something a minute ago.
Yeah. I'm back to my commands and laws and precepts. When Moses went up on the mount the first time, God sent him down with 10 commandments, right, on 2 tablets.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
He broke those 2 tablets and went back up on the mount. So was that when Torah was gave to Moses?
Well, again, the scripture only tells us one thing, and Dave might want to argue with this because it's traditional commentary, right? But the only other answer I could give you is that the belief, and I even heard Rabbi Kiva's Tat say this yesterday when I was believing, their belief and understanding is that the first time Moses went up on the mountain, everything was given. The Torah, all of it in its entirety, the oral Torah as they referred to it, all the commandments, everything contained therein. And that's what was shattered and that's what was broken. And when he came down the second time, all he came down with is the 10 words that God spoke to the people of the mountain.
Well, that was a lot of writing on 2 tablets that a person could carry.
Especially as they were stoned. He had to be strong.
Well, they can't all been on there because they had to do with the temple. A lot of them, not all of them, the temple, and the temple was not even dreamed of yet by humans.
So it wasn't actually get to him the second time because it was...
he was long dead. He was in. There's a series of laws that the Pharisees invented, added to the thing, involving especially the temple worship and their desire for money.
Yeah, so I'll say this again just to try and help create some level of understanding about why those that really have an issue with the law, I think in part have an issue with it. even in the book of Acts, you have Gentile believers that are coming to faith in Yeshua by the droves. And the Jews were not used to, in some of the synagogues, those that had received Paul or Peter's or James' teaching and had come to terms with who Yeshua was, and were starting to have their services in the synagogues in relation to understanding Yeshua as Messiah, are now finding in droves Gentiles wanting to come and participate. And they were not opposed to that to the beginning. And if one or two came in every once in a while, just like in our churches now, if one or two came in, that'd be great. But if suddenly some form of revival happened in this community and 2,000 people showed up in Mount Gilead in conjunction with the 1,200 people that are there on Sunday, some people would struggle quite a bit in figuring out how they're going to manage that, how they're going to get the flow to go through right, what they're going to do. And this is part of what the experience was in the way the Gentiles were coming converted. So this is what leads some of the disciples to go to Jerusalem and begin to have this meeting and this discussion about what should we be teaching them? What should we be telling them? Because they have been doing nothing of keeping the Torah or keeping our own man-made commandments or understanding. So when I said they believe Moses came down with the oral Torah, there is the God's Torah, there is the Torah that he made, the instruction he gave, and then the oral Torah are man-made commandments around it that the Jews in some places believe are just as viable to be observed because those are God's people, God's mouthpieces, just like Moses, who have designed this, and so you should observe it too. And when James stands in front of the council, basically, I'm going to paraphrase the whole situation, what he says is, our fathers have not been able to keep these burdens that you're tying, same words Yeshua said, our fathers have not been able to keep these same burdens we're tying on men's backs, so let's not give them all of that. And then what he says is, let's give them these 4 things. And we had a Bible study in here about a year ago about this. And he says, let's give them these 4 things. And most of those 4 things all deal with food laws. Tells them what to eat, what to consume, and how to have their being, because that was the biggest thing, and still is today, the biggest thing taking place that helps to differentiate how you establish your life in God's kingdom as opposed to how you establish your life as your own and you do whatever you want with it. So he gives them these laws, which are all Torah-specific commandments, not man-made ideologies, not man-made ideas of don't do this or that. He gives them specifically those commandments. And then he says, because the law of Moses is preached in the synagogue on every Sabbath. And so the idea is you give them, as Gentiles, these few things to start with, and then you encourage them to keep coming to the synagogue because the rest of God's Torah they're going to continue to hear about. Now, the issue is how far man decides to go with putting fences around God's Torah, and when man starts teaching tradition as commandment and commandment as tradition. When that problem comes in, we have all kinds of confusion.
Yes,
Yeah, that's where this problem comes in. So those that are in the local churches around here that are telling you the law has been nailed to the cross and been done away with, don't do it. Their fear is that through man-made legalism, people will start observing and keeping certain traditions that will take them away from having a relationship with Christ. For the most part, I would suffice it to say that that's probably their concern, right? If they had to voice, why are you so adamant about this? Why do you want to teach that so much? Why would you keep impressing upon me? This is, for the most part, what they're going to say is why. Because they don't want you to be drawn away from Christ. And some of the commandments, some of the instruction we've been given are things that could do that. But Yeshua himself started to draw some fences around the commandments when he says, if you even look lustfully at a woman, it is as though you committed adultery with her. Now, God didn't say that in the Torah, and God didn't say that there were crimes punishable by whatever punishment for thought crime, right? And I've heard many of the atheists have made great argument to make about how God punishes for thought crime, and that's ridiculous because of Yeshua's statement. When Yeshua designs that fence around the commandment, what he's doing, number one, is helping you see what it is that's going to first lead to adultery. Is the fact that you're looking at something and focusing your time and energy and attention on it when you shouldn't be. And it's not even just a man with a woman. It can also be a woman with shopping, or it can be a woman with anything that's going to cut off her relationship of intimacy with either her husband or her creator, right? Anything that's cutting off that intimacy or impacting it in a negative way, in a sense, could be considered adultery. And when Yeshua paints that fence, he's not only giving you an understanding of how you can find yourself in that situation and what you can do to prevent it, but he's also letting you know that it's sure to lead to that. You know, using your eyes in that fashion, that's not the the gift and the tool of eyes that we've been given is not so that we can chase after what we find to be a lust of the eyes and what we find to be pleasing. That was Eve's issue. The apple looked pleasing to the eyes. That's one of the first things it said before she reaches for it to take it and eat it. Right? Now that makes sense. But even Yeshua put some fences around the commandment. He just didn't teach that you should be setting aside God's commandment as a tradition, and you should be elevating tradition to the level of commandment and now observing that. We do that. Okay, so I feel like we had an open Bible study today,
Yeah,
and we haven't even got
to
you know, any.
Did we ever get around to Matthew?
No. Well, we've been doing actually talking nothing but Matthew, but where did we leave off? I don't remember if it was the second or third one. Yeah, that's what I thought.
We got to 1 and 2. Matthew 1 and 2.
All right, so on your sheet, I don't have page numbers on there, so you'll have to bear with me. This is where we're at, the blessings and woes. There's a couple things that we're doing on this sheet to get through a couple of them. We'll do a few more today. The Hebrew letter that we're looking at has a meaning. I will tell you the meaning. You can write it down on your page, and then we may find a way to see if that employs into the blessing, into the woe, or into the curse, as they're pronounced. And we'll continue to look at the correlation. So we are on the third one, which is the letter Ayin. This is the letter of perception, meaning I. This letter represents our learning to walk by faith and not by sight, and then teaching others to do likewise. And that's because the spiritual illustration of the letter Ayin is devotion. The letter that immediately follows this, which is the letter underneath, is the word pay, and pay means mouth. And whatever you find your eyes investing time into and looking at, you can be assured you're soon going to confess in your life because it's gotten all your attention. So when the letter Ayin means devotion, the letter pay means confession. Whatever you find yourself devoting your time to, you can be assured you're going to confess in your life. If you're devoting your time to doing good for those around you, then that will be the confession of who you are, and people will know you that way. If you devote yourself to yourself, then people will know you that way because you'll be confessing it. Make sense? Yeah. Whatever you devote your time to is what you're going to be confessing. Whatever you're looking at with your eyes, you will then be speaking about with your mouth. I find myself doing that on a regular basis. Things that I like as hobbies or whatnot. The collection of the cards that I collect and all that, man. I spend hours and hours looking at them. I find myself talking to Jen about them, and then 5 seconds later I look at her and I find her looking back at her phone or looking at the TV because she's not interested. And I don't blame her, right? So, Ayin. The third blessing is blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. And the third woe that Yeshua gave to the teachers is, woe to you, teachers of the Torah and the Pharisees, you hypocrites, you travel over land and sea to win a single convert. And when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as you are.
Yeah. Bye.
Mine.
Lord have mercy. I mean, so you can see the connection right off the bat. Blessed are those, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. And what do those that believe they are teachers and prophets of God's word do? They are willing to travel over land, sea, and air to try and win one more cult member, one more person that agrees with them, one more person that supports their view. And it's the meek who actually inherit what they are trying to take by force or by wiliness or by manipulation. You want to say something?
The Pharisees, those were the main religious leaders that were trying to follow the law step by step.
Pharisees and Sadducees, and there were also scribes, which were the writers of the Torah. Many of them, for the most part, yes, would have been found in groups discussing.
So these are the people that Jesus told that you've got to be more righteous than they are to inherit the kingdom.
It's not too hard.
Your righteousness must surpass that of the Pharisees. At one point he says, I'm trying to remember what the rest of the context of that is.
That's not overly hard.
Well, I mean, what am I trying to say? It seems like God was more concerned about our hearts than our physical being. Does that make sense? I mean,
yeah, the word meek.
I mean,
even the people that were trying to follow the law as close as they could didn't do it. I mean, they were going out of their way to be zealous about following the law. They couldn't do it. But the heart
They didn't.
was.
It's not necessarily a matter that they couldn't do it. I think the best way to define what you're really hitting the nail on the head with is that it didn't result in what it was supposed to. Again, the end goal of the law is Christ. Christ is the end goal of the law. So when you are supposed to be observing it in such a way, as John says, this is how we know we love the children of God, that we observe his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome, right? That burdensome is the same word that's used when Yeshua says, and they say in the Acts Council, the burdens you're heaping on our fathers, they couldn't bear, they couldn't keep. So the difference between what a man-made regulation, right, and God's regulation is that one is burdensome and the other is not. So it's not that keeping and observing God's commandments is burdensome, but we can make them burdensome by not doing them with love. By not understanding that observing and keeping them is for a goal of looking like him at the end of it. And all the time and the effort that the Pharisees put into keeping and observing God's law, when the person that they were supposed to look like came on the scene and showed up, they didn't recognize him. Because in their legalism and in their focus and in their attention of look at me as I wear long robes as I walk through the marketplace, look at me as I sit in the high places, their prestige that they were looking for doing what they thought was right is the only reward they got. Right? That's even the same thing that we could find today. A lot of people love to have the prestige of building, don't forgive me, I'm not meaning for this to be locally, I'm not trying to necessarily pinpoint anything, but sometimes we find great prestige in building the biggest building in the community. Sometimes we find great prestige in having the greatest message that everybody loves to hear. And sometimes we really appreciate the prestige of those that want to come sit down with us at a meal because they think we're better than them and they want to spend time with us. I mean, all of those things can go to a man's head, and all of those things can drive him or drive out of him humility. And I believe the word meek in this particular blessing is synonymous with what humility is and with what God would be meaning to some degree in humility.
The opposite of ego.
Yes. A meek person is somebody who isn't, and it doesn't necessarily mean poor, right? Because he already covered the poor in the first one. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. They arrive into that place even though they might have been thinking that they're not going to because they're poor in spirit. Blessed the meek can be those who clearly understand that what's being said to them is wrong and what God has revealed to them is right, and they're just not going to argue every single point that people want to argue with them. It's leave them alone. And they pray over them, and they pray that God continues to reveal for them what's necessary. Right? Because again, even in Larry's example, remember, blessed or anyone who teaches someone not to observe these things is considered least in the kingdom of heaven, and anyone who teaches people to observe these things is considered great in the kingdom of heaven. Both kinds of people are found in the kingdom of heaven, but they're found in different places, experiencing, the best way I can think to put it, is an experiencing an education of what the reality is. Right?
Maybe you can be both.
So, the next one, pay. This is the letter of speech, meaning mouth. This letter teaches us when to speak, and that the word of our Father Yeshua is to be found in all of our speech. That's why the spiritual illustration of this letter is confession. Again, whatever you devoted yourself to, you will soon confess. I don't know if I told you the other two definitions, but the first letter on your page, noon, spiritually illustrates humility. The next letter, Samic, support. Oh my gosh, I'm totally drawing a line. Did I say support? It literally means
It's typed
support.
right there.
I know, I literally said that, but what does your sheet say? Do you have your sheet?
Letter of support. Oh, yeah.
I can get it out of here too. Oh, it's right here in the front.
Trust,
Is that what I have?
uplifting and falling. Well, sport is the meaning.
No, trust is what I have on this page. So if anybody wants this page still, if you remember this, this is the little Hebrew alphabet letter thing, and everything in yellow that I have here is whatever I put down. If you want to compare. And just so that you know, let me tell you, we're starting again with the alphabetical structure. We're starting with the letter noon, and we're going through these 8 letters up until the last one. Right. So, humility, trust, devotion, right? When you humble yourself and you stop going after your will and what you want, it becomes much easier to trust God. And when you invest yourself in trusting God, you can easily become devoted to Him. If you trust only yourself, you'll be devoted to what you want and what you think is best. And whatever you become devoted to, you'll confess. Right? That's the connection. Pay. The fourth blessing is, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Woe to you, blind guides! You say, if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing. But if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, he is bound by his oath. You blind fools, which is greater, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred? You also say, if anyone swears by the altar, it means nothing, but if anyone swears by the gift on it, he is bound by his oath. You blind men, which is greater, the gift or the altar which makes the gift sacred? Therefore, he who swears by the altar swears by it and by everything on it, and he who swears by the temple swears by it and the one who dwells in it, and he who swears by heaven swears by God's throne and by the one who sits on it. And all of this is connected to, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. What do you think the connection is between these?
Don't swear. Stop swearing.
If you do, you better keep it. Right?
Yeah, if you say you believe it, you better keep it.
What they mean by swearing here is testifying to the truth or something, right?
Yeah. So, this is a real problem that we have regularly, which is really having, and I've said it a couple times, I think, in different ways, we regularly have to take a self-evaluative look at ourselves and figure out what our motives are. The person who says that the gold is better than the sanctuary, who honors it, is taking pride in the gold rather than a commandment God gave to tithe.
What's important?
Right? You're prioritizing things wrongly. The person who takes more delight in the sacrifice that they're laying down on the altar is probably looking to just fill their belly or fill their pride because they want people to see what the sacrifice is that they brought, rather than understanding that they are supposed to be giving it to God. That's what the purpose of the altar is laying down what you're going to present to Him, right? This is the connection to blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, because when you hunger and thirst for the righteousness of God, you get filled. When you hunger and thirst for a righteousness of your own, you get a reward here on this earth that isn't very satisfactory. It isn't very fulfilling. Many think it is. Millions and millions of dollars for many people is very satisfactory, right? Very fulfilling for them. But when they're consistently seeking after their own righteousness and could care less about really doing what's right of God, they're still empty.
Have you ever known somebody who's got all that? And are they happy? Are they content? Why does so many other people?
I've known one individual who had millions of dollars and kept a godly lifestyle and did things around himself. He was a member of Betacune. I've known 3 people that had millions of dollars who could have cared less about spiritual things, and they got so caught up in money that the love of money drove them practically insane.
Yeah. That's where it goes.
And I know clearly, I'm pretty confident, maybe I'll mature and become a completely different person that will know how to use it, but clearly, I do not need $1 million because I don't have it. So apparently I don't need it to accomplish whatever work God has got prepared for me, right? And that's really what we have to learn to hunger and thirst for, is what we need to accomplish what we have to do. Not after self-approval, not after people approval, community approval. We have to seek after the righteousness of the kingdom of heaven. What time is this? All right, I will, if you guys are still good, I will go to the next one, which is the letter Zadi. This is the letter of righteousness. That is literally what it spiritually illustrates. The letter Zadi has always been said to be drawn. If you look at the letter, it's on the next page. It's always been said to be drawn looking as though it were a man with his knees bent on the ground and his hands raised up in the air praying.
That's a good one.
And the word Zadi, literally a Zadik. So the next letter, if you look down, the letter Kof, if you're pronouncing the natural order of letters, you have Nun, Samek, Ayin, Pei, Zadi, Kof. And you hear that Zadik, Kof, right? The word Zadik, which is those two letters put together, is literally the word for a righteous person. A Zadik is a righteous man. Interestingly, for those of you that may be interested in Hebrew at some point, we're going to do Hebrew alphabet classes in here again soon. There's 5 letters in the Hebrew alphabet that take on a different form when they come at the end of a word. And in every case except for one, for 4 of those cases, instead of having a flat bottom of some sort, the letter just gets longer. And what's interesting is that flat bottom on Zadi goes away and it just basically stands up is what it looks like. And that's what it's said to do. And in the end, the righteous will stand. That's scripture. I don't remember what psalm that's from, but David wrote that in the end, the righteous will stand. And the letter Zadi, when it comes at the end of a word, it stands up every time. That play on words and that kind of understanding of things is not something man could have developed. So Zadi is a letter of righteousness. Just as Yeshua imparted his righteousness to us, so too we are to continue to share the righteousness of Yeshua in all we say and do. The 5th blessing. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give 1/10 of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat but swallow a camel. I think we talked about this a couple weeks ago. I can't remember, but did I tell you guys? You remember what we might have said about mint, dill, and cumin? Anybody ever plant any of those?
But yeah, you said that you
So you just have to
scatter.
ask around. You
Yeah.
don't have to actually plant.
Mint, yeah, and dill.
You really don't have to put in any effort at all whatsoever. You just let them fall to the earth, hit the soil, the seed will take root on its own, and it grows by itself. It doesn't need you at all. And that, oftentimes, is the level of effort that we put in to being merciful to people.
You strain out a net for cumin.
Yes. I'll tell you what that is here in a second.
Okay.
There's something in the Talmud, there's a discussion in the Talmud about that, and Yeshua is quoting the Talmud when he makes a statement, and they all know what he's talking about. We'll talk about that here in a second. But blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. There's an old Hebrew idiom. You can find it throughout commentary in nearly every book that's probably ever been written that certainly talks about repentance and a lot of other subject matters. As an old Hebrew understanding that you just find scattered regularly. I always have. And it's the idea that you should always be prepared to offer forgiveness to somebody, because there is, at bare minimum, even if you're in your immaturity, this is the only way you look at it, in bare minimum, you are going to offend God and require his forgiveness at some point. And being willing to forgive those who have wronged you and being willing to display mercy is a way for you to anticipate that mercy may be shown over you. But those that are merciful, those that are regularly focusing and planning with their lives to be merciful and loving on those around them, should expect that that's what happens. And even in our own understanding of children today, we exhibit that ideology. This is part of where it comes from. If you have 2 children, or if you have, no, you don't even need 2 children. Let's say you have a child, and that child, just for the most part, is just regularly, almost always doing what's right, never getting in trouble, never anticipating to really do anything wrong, and always doing what you ask them to do, and going above and
That
beyond.
wasn't me.
That wasn't me either.
I was gonna say, whose kid is that?
If you have a child who's doing this, and this is their behavior, it becomes much easier for you to overlook when they make a mistake, especially all the more if it wasn't intentional, right? But if the child is consistently doing what's wrong, and consistently being ungrateful, and consistently being unmerciful, and could care less about the feelings they hurt or the way in which people feel around them, it becomes much easier to assume that they're always going to be wrong. Now, God doesn't need to assume anything about us. He knows clearly what we're going to do. But in our human terms, it becomes much easier ingrained in our brains to assume that they're just always going to be bad natured and do something wrong, and to always be on the defensive and ready to put them in their place or shut them down or punish them or whatever else. And so this idea is that we should always be anticipating rather to be merciful. Now this idea at the end about you strain out a gnat but swallow a camel is because there is a huge discussion and debate in the Talmud about whether or not, you have to understand that wine is taken in nearly every spiritual ascending relationship. So when the Sabbath comes in, wine is used to welcome in the Sabbath. When people are getting married, when the first initial proposal of marriage is given, it's given with a cup of wine. Whether or not the bride drinks from it is a sign of whether or not she accepts that relationship. When Havdalah comes, which is the closing of the Sabbath, and on Saturday evenings when the Sabbath is leaving and we're entering back into the mundane world, wine is used to extinguish the fire of the candle, right? This is the Havdalah candle that's lit. Wine is used at practically every Jewish interval of any type of spiritual ascension when they believe they're transitioning into relationship, right? Not like simple prayers, but I mean like in any type of feast day. So every one of the appointed times, whether it's Passover or Shavuot, any of those appointed times, wine is used. So there is this discussion and debate in the Talmud about at what level it is acceptable to strain a gnat out of wine on the Sabbath. Because wine has to be used, and gnats are pretty traditionally known to buzz around it and get in it. And so there is a long discourse made, and I'm not going to mock it and say that it's not fruit-worthy, because there is some level of fruit that you can develop and produce in reading and understanding things. If you remember our Hanukkah study, we spent quite a bit of time learning some great lessons on what types of waxes and wicks should or shouldn't be used in lighting candles, right? And just reading that very in-depth, boring discourse on those things, as some people might look at it, was still beneficial for us, and it helped us to see and understand some things. So I don't necessarily want to mock the whole thing, but in this particular case, Yeshua is. And what he's explaining to them is you put all this emphasis on discussion about whether or not you're ingraining yourself in too much work to strain out this little tiny gnat from your wine, and whether or not you've absorbed unkosher eating on the Sabbath, and yet you're swallowing entire camels of not showing mercy to someone on the Sabbath, like the man with the withered hand in the synagogue, that they think should just leave and come back on a day that's not the Sabbath to get healed, right? That's an example of what Yeshua was experiencing, is people who are not able to prioritize. Going back to our next one, these two blessings and woes, Zadi and the letter paid before, they're actually also interconnected in the scripture, because it shows what I was trying to talk to you guys about a few weeks ago. If A is greater than B and B is greater than C, then by default you understand that A is greater than C, right? If A is greater than B and B is greater than C, then by default A is greater than C. And in this particular example, Yeshua shows them and tells them concerning circumcision, that they still circumcise a child and don't worry about this relationship right on the Sabbath. What he's showing them is that if the temple is greater than, if man is greater than the Sabbath, and the temple is greater than man, and what you do, and how the priest still needs to do the work on the Sabbath, and he's not profaning anything or doing it, then you clearly need to understand that if A is greater than B, then then the other one's greater. So having man and still doing, I think I put some of those in the wrong order, but still doing the temple service on the Sabbath and still circumcising a baby on the Sabbath means that man is greater than the Sabbath, right? If you consider the Sabbath to be greater than man, but yet a child is still circumcised on the Sabbath to fulfill the law of Moses, to fulfill what God commanded about circumcision, if you're still looking at fulfilling these other commandments in the temple on the Sabbath and you don't think it's a violation, which is what they said, which is what the commentary proved, then understand that man is greater than the Sabbath. And so a man who has an injured hand should be healed on the Sabbath. No more, no less than a man who's got an ass that's fallen into a ditch on the Sabbath. I don't know if that makes sense, but these are kind of connected because that's what the language is. Go back and reread. For pay, that's where he's talking about anyone swearing by the gold of the temple. How do you not know that it's the temple and the sanctuary itself that makes the gold holy? Anything that comes in contact with the altar is made holy because that's what God said. So when you bring your sacrifice to the altar, it's not that what you're bringing is better than the altar. It's that the position that your sacrifice is elevated to is only elevated to that because it comes in contact with God's altar. Maybe we'll do one more and then we'll stop and pick the rest of this up next week, and I'll have some more planned too. The next one is the letter Kof. The letter Kof spiritually illustrates holiness. Right? And one thing that you find when I teach these letters is that a lot of these letters go hand in hand with one another. Ayin and Pei, I and Mouse go together very clearly. What you devote yourself to is what you'll soon confess. And then the next letter, righteousness, or Zadi is the letter of righteousness, and Kof is the letter of holiness. Righteousness and holiness always go together. And the reason why is because the righteousness you are performing should only be for the sole purpose of setting yourself apart unto God. That's what holiness is being set apart. If the righteousness you're performing is so that others can see it and others can pat you on the back for how good of a job you're doing, then that is all the reward you will get or should expect. Our Father in heaven is holy, and so too we have been made holy. We are holy unto the Lord and capable of righteous acts because we are holy. If God had not set us apart, and if Yeshua had not come and broken down that wall of hostility between us, if those things had not been done away with, we wouldn't be able to observe God's law. In the idea of whether or not it's even been done away with, there still lies the fact that what right do I have when I can be as wicked as I am and when I can choose to be as unmerciful as I have proven to do in the past, even the recent past? Who do I even think I am, and what right do I have to even do a good deed for somebody? Go ahead, Dave.
Our Father in heaven is holy. No doubt about that statement. But what about the remaining sentence there? Is it because he's holy that we are? I don't think so. But he's done.
Well, it says our Father in heaven is holy, and so too we have been made holy.
And we have been made holy.
Yeah.
I got the word made in there.
Yeah. In conjunction with that, though, remember what God says to you, what he says to all of us: be holy, because I am holy.
It's a good reason.
He makes you set apart by creating for you the laws that you can observe, the commandments, the mitzvah, as they're referred to, the mitzvah themselves. The Torah is the light, and the mitzvah, the commandment, is the lamp. That's what Proverbs 6:23 says. And so every one of those instructions is a way to shine light. And what should that light make visible? What should that light be shining and revealing? Right? If we say that Yeshua is the end of the law, the end goal, then it should be displaying him.
I picked out one word there. We are holy unto the Lord and capable.
In other words, it's your choice.
Yeah. We have been set apart, and we continue to show ourselves set apart by doing the things of God. And no power in and of myself enables me to do righteous acts for my neighbor and see any form of credit come out of that, whether it's God crediting me for doing what he's commanded. The only reason I'm capable of that is because of what Christ did. Christ laying down his life and removing the wall of sin that blocked me from being able to get up and walk out of that muck and mire and do what God has commanded me to do. Right? The sixth blessing. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. The sixth woe. Woe to you teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and the dish, and then the outside will also be clean. For the most part, that's pretty self-explanatory. Your heart is located on the inside of your body. If the righteous acts you perform on the outside of your body are not changing the inside of your body, then you have another motive. Anybody got questions, thoughts, anything before we? All right, well, I'm going to turn off